So this is a very hard thing to develop, to exercise, and Hawke had to do so, as I talk about in the book, quite early on, when before the government had sat a single day in Parliament, there was a security scandal which involved David Coombe from South Australia, the former General Secretary of the party, and then Mick Young, and also from South Australia. And Mick and Bob were extremely close, but Hawke realised that what Mick had done was...
he'd been a bit loose-lipped.
He'd been loose-lipped, unfortunately, to a degree which was... well, he'd broken the Crimes Act, and the sentence for that was 2 years jail.
I think it happens every day.
Not,
there are little breaches of the Crimes Act.
Little breaches of the Crimes Act, but in the circumstance of a new government and a very hostile opposition which regarded itself as having a right to rule, it was extraordinarily dangerous. So Bob had to decide that he would ask Mick for his resignation, but it didn't get to that. Mick offered it.
Well,
yeah.
Mick got in first.
Mick got in first and knew he had to resign. Yeah. So that was that distance. He said it was the worst thing he ever had to do in politics. It was it almost killed him.
Yeah, that's
because
if you think that was a hot start for the government, 2 days after the election, they devalued the dollar.
Mm. Yes, yes.
Which was the beginning of that whole sequence of quite courageous economic reforms.
And Michael, you left out something. The day after the election, the Sunday morning, the Secretary of the Treasury came in and said, Prime Minister, I have to tell you that our deficit is 9.6 billion, which is in today's terms is about $40 billion. And this was information which the Fraser government was keeping very quiet. So there was an instant economic crisis to deal with in the form of the deficit.
Of which the very well-connected then leader of the opposition actually had some inkling.
Yes.
But couldn't say.
Yes.
So the big black hole when you come into government is nothing new.
But you've still got to deal with it.
But you had to deal with it. And the devaluation was really the first of a very rapid series of quite significant economic developments. The conclusion of the Accord, on which he'd been working, and he and others have been working for some time.
That was foundational to the economic reforms they wanted to bring in.
Indeed, and at the end of 1983, the first year, they float the dollar over the not dead but unhappy body of the Secretary of the Treasury, John Stone. And with all of this disruption going on at the end of 1983, what's his approval rating?
75%. Yes.
Now you know why they still have him up in Brisbane campaigning this week. I would have thought it'd be a two-edged sword these days to have Bob campaigning in your electorate. Your recognition factor wouldn't improve very much. But
photo opportunities.
Blanche, there are such. Before we let everyone else have a go, there are so many more things that we could be discussing. Is this paradox of this man who has this mass audience as one of his apparent great political assets, but turns out to build most of his important political achievement on intimate personal relationships with the Chinese leaders,
yes,
with George Shultz,
yes,
and so on and on it goes, and it's an interesting point because which I can't ask you to develop much because there's one question I have to ask you. In the contrast between Hawke and Keating is often painted as being that Hawke had the touch with the audience and Keating was very good one-to-one. But in fact, Hawke was both.
Yes, that's true. And yes, he had intensely intimate relations with the Chinese leadership at that time, which was quite extraordinary.
And I slid past the name of George Shultz
a bit
quickly. He was he was Reagan's Secretary of State.
And he got on very well with Reagan too.
Yeah.
They used to tell jokes, often dirty ones.
I can't believe that.
I mean, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Blanche, before I cut myself off and open it up to the floor, there's one thing I would like to touch on. Your method for this book involved a lot of fairly recent interviews with colleagues and former staff members, and you explained at the launch that that was something that hadn't been possible, particularly with those who'd been on Bob's staff over the years, because they felt bound to keep the confidences for a very long time. But at this great distance of time, they felt free to talk, and their contribution to the book is very obvious when you read it. But memory is a shifting story.
Yes.
Not necessarily because it fails, although it does in my case from time to time, but because with the passage of time, memories change. What is relevant to people changes over time. Did that cause you any difficulties? Did you encounter things where people's memories had changed a bit radically when you went back to check the interview against the research? Yes,
and I found that going right back to the Kirby book. Memory is a very unstable animal, and will play a lot of tricks. So there's no easy answer to dealing with that. If in lacking a written record of something, if you're doing oral histories, but the only method I know is to ask as many people as you can about the same thing and see what seems to be the prevailing view of what happened. Or alternatively just say, he said this, and they're nearly all he's, but he said that. So just put in these shifting memories. And it's really funny what, in the same circumstance, what parts of it different people will remember. So I've just tried to give that colour.
Well, indeed.
And Michael, I just should say one other thing. There have been a huge number of books written by former Hawke ministers, for example, and about the Hawke government. And I really tried to go into, not to just repeat what others had said, but to go into new areas. So, for example, I haven't covered the contributions of most of the ministers, only in passing, because that has been covered by themselves or in books. I just wanted to concentrate on this issue of leadership and this whole dark area of memories of the staff and the very senior public servants.
And I think you'll find, when you read the book, that you understand why it couldn't be a 20,000 word addition to the previous book, because there is so much to it and to absorb. And in the end, as you've discovered, as we've tried to tease it out, you don't have a one line for what sort of a leader Bob was, but you do have a feel for it. Blanche, it's time for me to sit still and quiet, but you're not off the hook.
Right, thank you, Michael.